I could have your attention. So I want to begin our conversation today by first acknowledging with respect that we are meeting on the lands of the Kwanghan, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples, on whose territory the university stands, and the Kwanghan and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. My name is Davina Bandar, and I'm the chair of the Gender Studies Department and a settler here. My own family history has been implicated and affected by colonization and histories of settler colonialism, which brought our family here from Punjab, India in the early 1900s. Needless to say, settler colonialism is a continued global project managed by shifting institutional norms and global structures. Today, we are very fortunate to have in this room both Mouin Rabbani and his esteemed partner in life, Hasmik Aydin, who between them hold many years of extensive experience in and through the UN and global forms of governance. Mouin Rabbani, who will be speaking on the topic of Gaza in a global context, is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and contemporary Middle East. He has, among other positions, served as Principal Political Affairs Officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Head of Middle East with the Marty Atasari Peace Foundation, Senior Middle East Analyst and Special Advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group, and researcher with Al-Haq, West Bank affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists. And if you are anything like me, who's been avidly trying to find more news about the current contemporary global context that we are in, you must have gone to Jedalea, which Mouin is the co-editor of. He also co-hosts the Connections podcast and co-hosts the Long Form Conversations podcast and edits its Quick Thoughts features. He is a contributing editor of Middle East Report. He is the author of numerous articles and opinion pieces. He has also co-authored and co-edited a number of books. His Gaza Apocalypse, Causes and Consequences is a forthcoming book from OR Press. I would like to thank Martin Budden and Elizabeth Vibert from the History Department for their organizing efforts in hosting and making this talk possible. And also, I'd like to thank our funders, the Imperial Entanglements Global Justice Lecture Series. And without further delay, please join me in welcoming Mouin Rabbani.
Thank you very much, and I'm grateful to all of you for being here, to the University of Victoria for this invitation, and particularly to Professors Davina Bandar, my old friend and colleague, Professor Martin Bunton, and Professor Elizabeth Vibert, or is it Vibert, for the opportunity to be with you today. Allow me to begin with a citation. Palestine is a little country, but what is being done in Palestine is symptomatic of the entire state of the world. It is the methods being used in Palestine, rather than the particular settlement which may be reached, to which I wish to direct attention. These methods, I will try to show, are disastrous. And if we persist in using them elsewhere in the world, and there is every indication that we shall, the result can only be violence and war. This is the real lesson of Palestine. It is not an isolated issue. It touches the future of the whole world. Just as Guernica was a good testing ground for German and Italian methods of war, so Palestine is the testing ground of our peace policies. Our methods there, our whole emotional and irrational approach to the problem, expose the hollowness and futility of our protestations about peace. These words were written not in 2026 or 2025, but rather in February 1947, a few months before the United Nations General Assembly adopted its resolution for the partition of Palestine, and they were written by a gentleman by the name of W.T. Stace, a former British colonial official, I believe, in what was then Ceylon, what is today Sri Lanka, and who wrote these words when he was affiliated with Princeton University's Department of Philosophy. And I would recommend that we keep his words in mind as we continue to engage with the question of Palestine, and particularly the way it is unfolding before us. As for my own words, I'd like to say a few things about the Gaza genocide, its background, features, and objectives, to discuss how it has continued since major hostilities were suspended in October of last year, and finally to examine the relevance of the recently established Board of Trump, otherwise known as a Board of Peace, to the future of Palestine. It is important to recognize that the Gaza Strip as a unit is of fairly recent provenance. Gaza City is, of course, among the very oldest cities on earth, and others, such as Khan Yunis to its south, also have a storied history. But if you had consulted a map in 1945, or asked a specialist on the question of Palestine or the Middle East about where you might find the Gaza Strip, it would have been nowhere to be found, and you would have elicited little more than a blank stare. This is because the Gaza Strip is a direct product of the Nakba of the late 1940s and early 1950s, during which more than 75% of the Arab population of the territory that became the State of Israel was forced out and, crucially, thereafter prevented from returning to their homes. The Gaza Strip, as it emerged, constituted that 1%, or 1.1% to be precise, of mandatory Palestine located in its extreme southwest, abutting Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea, that territory that did not come under Israeli rule. It is in fact also but a small part of what had previously been known as the Gaza District. As a result of the Nakba, the territory's native population of some 80,000 people expanded by approximately 200,000 destitute and desperate refugees. In other words, the population of this vastly reduced territory more than tripled almost overnight. Conditions were not so very different from those we are familiar with, all too familiar with, today. And Palestinians, as well as relief workers present at the time, such as those from the Quakers and the International Committee of the Red Cross, have written movingly about the conditions they encountered at that time. Virtually from the outset, Israel adopted two policies with respect to the Gaza Strip. On the one hand, an absolute refusal to permit the refugees to return to their homes and their hometowns and villages. And secondly, commencing very shortly afterwards, promoting initiatives to drive the refugee population of the Gaza Strip further away from Israel's boundaries. Most of these refugees had come from southern Palestine, often on foot, and essentially lived within spitting distance of their former homes. Israel correctly feared their irredentist potential, and the Gaza Strip was in fact a primary incubator, more so than Jerusalem, than Nablus, than Cairo, than Amman, than Damascus, or than Beirut, of the contemporary Palestinian national movement. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Israel advanced various schemes to expel the Palestinian population, to thin the population out, as it put it, from the Gaza Strip to places such as Libya, Iraq, and elsewhere. After the second Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip commenced in 1967, Israel also began implementing schemes to remove them to Jordan, to the occupied Sinai Peninsula and West Bank, and even to Paraguay in a deal struck by Israel with that country's neo-Nazi regime. As the leading scholar of the Gaza Strip, Sarah Roy of Harvard University has written, after 1967, Israel also pursued a policy of de-development towards the Gaza Strip. De-development, as distinct from underdevelopment, is the deliberate, systematic dismantling of an economy and its potential in order to ensure that it cannot develop in future. Simply put, to make the territory unfit for human habitation and thereby ensure its residents are left with no option but to leave. Those of you who visited the Gaza Strip prior to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994 will recognize that Roy knows whereof she speaks. The ambition to depopulate the Gaza Strip never quite disappeared, but beginning around the late 1970s was no longer pursued as a priority because it was deemed impractical. Seen as a fantasy of Israel's extreme right and their allies in the global far right and Christian Zionist cult, it also never entirely disappeared. And in October 2023, it came back with a vengeance. This time, the mass expulsion of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip also enjoyed the support of the United States. In late 2023, then U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken toured the Middle East essentially as an errand boy for Israel, seeking to sell the idea to Washington's Arab client regimes. The proposal was unanimously rejected, and for good reason. As we've seen since the beginning of the Gaza genocide, Arab states are prepared to assume a posture of inertia, of indifference, while Israel slaughters Palestinians in their own homeland. But it draws the line at their expulsion to their own countries, because when Israel did so in 1948, the loss of Palestine served as a catalyst for a decade of coups, revolutions, and uprisings throughout the Arab world, and additionally drew these neighboring states into direct conflict with Israel over the succeeding decades. Palestine was far from the only reason for the regional upheaval, not even the primary one, but it did serve as the essential catalyst. And already suffering a severe legitimacy deficit and cognizant of a decade of upheaval during the 2010s, the Arab leaders of the 2020s needed this direct challenge to their national security that would be represented by them accepting a mass expulsion of Palestinians. They needed that like a hole in the head, and they essentially told Blinken to take a hike. Beginning in late 2023 and throughout 2024 and 2025, Israel focused not just on the slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinians and seeking to eradicate Palestinian armed groups, Hamas and others, in the process extinguishing a proportion of civilians so high that it had last been witnessed during the 1994 Rwanda genocide, but its operations also focused specifically, explicitly, and deliberately on civilian infrastructure. The health sector, the education sector, and higher education in particular, the housing stock, water and wastewater infrastructure, all were systematically destroyed. And still Palestinians would not leave, and those who wanted to couldn't do so. First, because Egypt kept its border with Gaza sealed, and then because Israel took physical control of the border crossing, ensuring that anyone who left would be prohibited from returning. In February of last year, the Trump administration, picking up where its Democratic predecessor had left off, unveiled its Gaza Riviera proposal. The Palestinians would be expelled en masse to Egypt and Jordan, and the Gaza Strip would be transformed into one more Trump casino. This time, the Arab states, individually, collectively, and very publicly, rejected Trump's proposal and did so in no uncertain terms. Once again declined the loan, Trump quietly declared the bankruptcy of his proposal. Israel's inability to achieve a decisive military victory in the Gaza Strip and growing pressure on Washington from his Arab investors to remove Gaza and its horrors from the daily headlines in September 2025 produced what is known as the Trump Initiative. It was decidedly not a peace plan, but rather, and at least initially, a three-part proposal to deal with the future of the Gaza Strip. First, the immediate issues, such as a cessation of hostilities, an exchange of captives, a surge in humanitarian supplies, and the partial withdrawal of Israeli forces within the Gaza Strip to what was known as the Yellow Line. Secondly, a new administration for the Gaza Strip, Palestinian disarmament, and what was termed Palestinian Authority reform. And third, discussions about an entirely undefined political horizon. At the conclusion of his 29 September joint White House press conference with Netanyahu, Trump also unveiled what was termed a board of peace, which he would lead. It was at the time dismissed, even ridiculed, as just another Trump vanity project. With the deadline of the Nobel Peace Prize rapidly approaching, Trump railroaded the Israelis into concluding an agreement with Hamas by 10 October, producing the 8 October agreement. Since Hamas had accepted only the first clauses of the proposal, the agreement covered only these immediate issues, and the rest of the can was kicked down the road. Trump, to his chagrin, had to make do with the inaugural FIFA World Peace Prize, awarded by the obsequious sycophant Gianni Infantino. If we look at the implementation of the 8 October agreement, what we see is that, according to U.S. intelligence, the U.S. was taken aback, surprised by the extent to which the Palestinians fulfilled in detail their commitments under this agreement. Israel, for its part, and now I'm not relating the position of U.S. intelligence, has violated each and every one of its commitments under that agreement. Most particularly, it has continued to obstruct the delivery of urgently needed humanitarian supplies, medications, shelter. We've now witnessing infants and others dying of exposure during the winter months. It has, most importantly, of course, not ceased hostilities. It has, in daily bombings and shellings and shootings, it has killed well over 500 people, primarily civilians, since October 8th. And it has sought to expand the area of its direct control by seeking to move the Yellow Line westwards. But the other thing that we've witnessed is that the Board of Peace, which was for many people just added as an afterthought, has now taken center stage. It was unveiled, as you may recall, at the annual conclave of the rich and objectionable that is held in the Swiss resort city of Davos every year. And here we saw a particularly bizarre organism. So you have a board of peace, which is composed of a number of governments represented by their heads of state or heads of government. Under that, you have a board of peace executive committee composed primarily of Americans. You have Prince Jared of Kushner, you have Steve Witkoff, you have Witkoff's assistant secretary for repressing Palestinian activism in the U.S., Marco Rubio. You have a Cypriot Israeli businessman whose name eludes me. You have, of course, Tony Blair. And you also have an official named Nikolai Mladenov, a former Bulgarian foreign minister who thereafter served as the UN representative in Iraq and in Jerusalem. Mladenov, for his part, is the person directly assigned to supervise a committee known as the Gaza National Administration Committee. This is a 15-person committee composed of unaffiliated Palestinians, led by an individual named Ali Sha'ath, who was a former deputy minister in the Palestinian Authority, said to be a competent technocrat. But the most important thing to understand about this Gaza National Administrative Committee is that it has no authority. It does not formulate policy. It cannot implement its own priorities. It works at the discretion of the Board of Peace Executive Committee. It is the Board of Peace Executive Committee that decides what, how. It has basically, according to the relevant documents, assumed full legislative authority and responsibility and all other competencies in the Gaza Strip. And this, in turn, is subject to the full personal discretion of none other than Donald Trump. If you read the charter of the Board of Peace, it is Trump and he alone who determines the composition of this body. He can invite people, he can expel them from the Board of Peace. All decisions taken by the Board of Peace are subject to his approval and discretion. And of course, most dangerously, the United Nations Security Council, in its resolution 2803, approved the Trump initiative, including what was then still an undefined Board of Peace. So the international community, or particularly the Security Council membership's appeasement of Donald Trump, has created this body that is now expanded itself well beyond the Gaza Strip and has given itself the authority to get involved in conflicts and crises and negotiations essentially anywhere else in the world. And it is doing so, at least implicitly, with the consent of the Security Council. And you will probably have seen analysts who have suggested that Washington's ultimate aim with this Board of Peace is to set up an alternative to the United Nations and its Security Council. I think there's something to be said by that. But the other half of that is that this Board of Peace is, in my view, so closely tied to Trump the person that it's difficult to conceive of how this body can outlast him. Which, to put it rather bluntly, we're essentially one Big Mac away from the collapse of the Board of Peace. Now, I would like to, before taking your questions and comments, I would like to make some comments about the regional dimensions of this. We're now seeing growing talk of a potential new war with Iran, although there are also, as you know, U.S.-Iranian negotiations slated to commence in the Omani capital, Muscat, tomorrow. Now, are we on the verge of war? Is war imminent? Are we on the verge of a new diplomatic breakthrough? Or, given how unpredictable the current U.S. leadership is, are both possible? But what I find most interesting is the changing attitudes of a number of Arab states. As you will recall, during the first Trump administration, the GCC states, for the most part, were fully on board with Trump's policy of maximum pressure on Iran. They fully supported Washington's unilateral renunciation of the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. But then several things happened. First, Saudi Arabia was subjected to repeated drone and missile strikes from the Houthis in Yemen, who perhaps, I believe it's more accurate to characterize them as Iranian supported than as an Iranian proxy. Secondly, in 2019, the Iranians, this time directly, even though they did not take direct responsibility for it, launched a sophisticated and very successful strike against the most vital oil facilities in the world, those of Aramco in eastern Saudi Arabia, and knocked them out of commission for a few days. And the United States, at the time, proved itself either unwilling or unable, or both, to defend its Arab partners. And this led to a change in attitude among them, of understanding that in any major war between the United States and Iran, they would be directly in the line of fire, and they would not be in a position either to defend themselves or to be defended by their US allies. And during the Biden administration, you saw a process of normalization. Most importantly, the resumption of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, mediated by China at the time. Fast forward to October 2023, and particularly at the period since then, and these countries see Iran as having been significantly weakened, contained, if you will. And with talk of war, their position is the following. If they had confidence that a new US war against Iran would lead to regime change in Tehran and its replacement with a stable government, I don't think they would have any particular objections to that. But they don't have that confidence. What they believe is that in the event of a new war, Iran will take the gloves off because it feels, the Iranian leadership in Tehran feels that its policy of strategic patience, as it was called during the previous years, has failed. And just as importantly, that its policy of restraint in response to previous Israeli attacks has also failed. And that the Iranian leadership therefore believes that in the event of a new war, it needs to strike immediately, and it needs to strike hard, and it needs to transform any confrontation with either the United States or Israel into a regional conflict in order to end it as soon as possible. And therefore, you have these countries seeking to influence Washington to avoid a new war. And that also reflects their changing attitude towards Israel. I think it's fair to say that previously, many of these governments, particularly but not only the United Arab Emirates, viewed Israel as a valued strategic and security partner, particularly when it came to containing and weakening Iran. But that has changed fundamentally over the past 2 years. They now see Israel as the regional arsonist, the pyromaniac who is being given a limitless supply of kerosene and matches by the United States, which is consistently expanding its circle of fire in the region. And a particular turning point for them was the Israeli bombing of the Qatari capital, Doha, in September of last year. Because in contrast to Israeli attacks in the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Doha, you essentially had one U.S. ally bombing another with U.S. approval. And this sent red lights flashing throughout the Gulf. And I think Trump's unveiling of his initiative in late September cannot be isolated from the growing pressure that the Arab governments were seeking to exercise on Washington at the time of, we need to find a way to bring an end to this before it expands even further. So, in conclusion, I would like to refer once again to the citation of W.T. Stace that I read at the outset. We are essentially at a fork in the road. Do we continue the descent to the law of the jungle and see that what has been normalized in the Gaza Strip, what was not normalized in Ukraine, because that was seen as a clear violation of international law, but that what was normalized in Gaza becomes the global norm? Or do we succeed in imposing fundamental standards of accountability, of respect, not only for international law, but of the universal norms and values and principles that underpin it in international conduct and conflict resolution? And I think that is the fundamental question for all of us, and what will determine the world that we come to live in, because Gaza and the question of Palestine more broadly is once again, as it was in February 1947 when Stace was writing, the canary in the coal mine that will determine our future. Thank you very much. With pleasure.
So, do we have any questions?
Should I stand?
Whatever you prefer.
My name is Nazim. You must have read Saad Al-Azim's book, Self-Criticism After the Defeat. In there, I found some lessons for the Palestinians, and I read it before the 47. And I was surprised to see actually the mistakes that were made, outlined by Saad Al-Azim, were not repeated, at least some of them. What do you attribute the Palestinian resistance to stay on the land? How do you, is it simply people know where to go? Or
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood that last point.
yes,
What do I attribute?
the Palestinian resistance or steadfastness to stay on the land, not to give up the fight. It's not just the leadership telling them to stay here, but they have stayed committed to their land, which Azim describes as their pride or their, how do you say that? Their honor.
Mm-hmm.
What do you attribute to Palestinian resistance and stay on the ground?
Well, let me first make a broader point, because this goes back, I think, to Israel's objectives vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip and the question of Palestine more broadly. I gave the examples of Blinken and Trump, this idea of expelling the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip en masse, and how that failed, essentially on account not of a Palestinian insistence of remaining on their land so much as a rejection of these proposals by the Arab governments. So what you are now seeing are two things. I believe that Israel is seeking to maintain and amplify conditions in the Gaza Strip that can roughly be compared to those that you had in Syria a decade ago. In Syria, people were not put on trucks and buses and shipped off to Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. Rather, people came to the conclusion that their conditions of life, their prospect, had become so intolerable that their very survival depended on them putting themselves on trucks and buses and going to Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon. And that's Israel's approach. If you can't have a tsunami, you settle for a trickle, and you have the patience to ensure that the trickle achieves the objective. That's number one. The problem for Israel, and this is and the second Israeli objective, I think, is that it would like to see the question of Palestine once again revert to the dimensions that defined it between 1948 and 1967, a humanitarian issue, not a political crisis. If you recall, United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967 that put an end to the June 1967 war and lays forth the basis for a peaceful resolution of this entire conflict, does not even mention Palestine or Palestinians. It only refers to a just resolution of the refugee question, because Palestinians were seen as a humanitarian question in need of shelter, education, healthcare, not of self-determination or political rights. And for Israel, that would be an acceptable way to redefine the Palestinian issue. We're all talking about the blockade, about infants dying of exposure in the middle of winter, about the elderly who can't get their diabetic medication. Those are absolutely urgent and essential issues, but they are symptoms of a political crisis rather than the crisis itself. And in answer to your question, the difference between Palestinians and Syrians is that the Syrian who left Syria in 2012 or 2015 knew that at the end of the day, he or she or they would be able to return to their homeland if there was political change in Damascus or under certain conditions. For Palestinians, it's a one-way ticket. You leave, you're gone. And they have the experience to prove it from 1948, from 1967, from other times. And secondly, is what I alluded to now, that yes, you can bribe the Egyptian border official and get yourself out and maybe your family, but this mass expulsion is no longer, or at least barring extreme circumstances, is not going to be an option for the Israelis. So on the one hand, I would say the Palestinians are rooted in their land, having been abandoned by their own leaders, by all their own leaders, have no option but to remain on their land. And secondly, they also understand that if they do leave their own land, it's gone forever.
Did you want to add something?
I wonder if, just returning to this sort of analogy that you used, the humanitarian versus the political crises.
Yes.
How can we help turn this from a humanitarian issue, where we just send money to help them, the Palestinians continue to survive in misery, into a political issue that cannot be ignored in the world? And I wonder whether, just to go to your initial quote, the focus of that quote was on methods. But it seems to me that, especially if we look at the Genocide Convention, the methods issue is, well, it's not secondary to, but it is very intimately linked to intention.
Correct.
And so, in a sense, I mean, we've got to turn the issue as well, I think, towards intentions.
Yes. Well, if your question is specifically about genocide, a state could be.
That's what you've described, isn't it?
That's what I've described. But to get to your comment, I mean, you can commit all the crimes that are listed in the Genocide Convention and not be guilty of genocide unless you have also done so with a specific intent. And my view, well, certainly the view of South Africa and the countries that have joined its submission to the International Court of Justice, the conclusion reached by a growing consensus of genocide and Holocaust scholars, including the International Association of Genocide Scholars and of many others, is that Israel has met that crucial test of intent. I should add that the ultimate arbiter of this question is not going to be these scholars and jurists and others. It's going to be the 15 judges of the International Court of Justice. And it's going to be a very high bar to cross, because if you look at precedent to the extent that that is relevant, in the case of the former Yugoslavia, of Bosnia, they took a very restrictive definition of genocide, in which essentially, even if you have the intent, if I can ascribe any other plausible reason for why you committed those crimes, then it's not genocide. And but that was 10 years ago, or longer. And now you have a very interesting case before the ICJ, the Myanmar case, where you have a number of Western governments, I believe including Canada, that have made submissions to the court, saying that its criteria for determining genocide is restrictive beyond what the Genocide Convention intended. And if the court accepts these submissions, that will have consequences for the Palestine case, which is going to be decided after the Myanmar case. That's my. And secondly, regarding your question, first of all, I do think it's, particularly now, absolutely essential to keep the urgent humanitarian requirements of the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip front and center, because these are literally issues of life and death for hundreds of thousands of people. And we simply, under no circumstances, can look at what these people are enduring and say, actually, there are more important issues that we need to focus on. But what we do need to do is to make clear that we're not dealing with a natural disaster. We're not dealing with people starving to death because of a drought or failed harvest or tsunami or earthquake. These are the humanitarian symptoms of a fundamentally political man-made crisis. And I think that is a connection that can and should be made.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
With regard to the regional scenario,
Yes.
as we spoke about at the end, what is your view on the perspective that the GCC countries are only too content to see the Iranian regime violently quell a broad-based uprising, whatever arguments one might make about diverse, forms of inspiration for the uprising? And in this way, it perhaps sort of ironically parallels the GCC countries being only too content to see Palestinian sovereign ambitions quelled as well, and to essentially wash their hands of the Palestinian dilemma as so many Arab states.
Sorry, is your question that if it would be accurate to say that the GCC states are actually quite content to see a new war against Iran and regime change in Tehran? Is that?
No, not that.
Yeah.
Rather, almost that they're content to see the status quo,
Yes.
which has violently quelled
Yes.
the uprising.
Yes. No, I think that sounds about right for a number of reasons. First of all, Iran is, of course, not an Arab country, but it sits immediately across the Persian Gulf from very many Arab countries and borders a very important one, namely Iraq. And you have the experience of the 2010s of Arab upheaval, so-called Arab Spring, and I don't think that very many of these leaderships would be quite happy to see a popular uprising succeed, even if its result is the removal of a regime which they have traditionally viewed with quite a bit of distaste. That's number one. Secondly, as I tried to explain, even absent a war, they're very concerned about instability. And one reason is that, they have, they're, for many years, their sights were very much set on Iran and Iran's expanding regional influence and their fears about the prospect of Iranian regional hegemony. Many of them have concluded that that project is now at an end. Hezbollah has been significantly weakened. The Ba'athist regime in Syria is no more. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, that is how they see it. And they see Israel as a newly emerging hegemon. And if you look at it from the perspective of these Gulf states, particularly from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, it's not so much about what they think about Israel specifically, but they just do not want to be at the mercy of a regional hegemon, whether it was Egypt in the 1950s, or Iran 10 years ago, or Israel tomorrow. And therefore, they would like to see Israel constrained. And that also explains, I think, to a very significant degree, the Saudi Emirati rift that we saw at the beginning of this year. As you may recall, there's if I could just take a minute to explain this, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were close partners beginning in 2015 in seeking to change the reality in Yemen after Ansar Allah, commonly known as the Houthis, seized power in the capital, Sana'a. They had been supporting different groups in the remainder of Yemen. And the Emiratis worked primarily through an organization known as the Southern Transitional Council, a secessionist movement that had been reigning supreme in the key city of Aden, for many years, and in a number of provinces in the former South Yemen. And in December, it launched an offensive in which it seized Hadramaut, one of the largest, or if not the largest, Yemeni province, which also contains a very significant proportion of Yemen's energy resources. And east of that, the province of Mahra, which, like Hadramaut, also directly borders Saudi Arabia, but also directly borders Oman. And this, for the Saudis, set the alarm bells ringing, because they saw this also in the context of the close Israeli-Emirati partnership. They tied it to Israel's recent recognition of Somaliland in Somalia, and already receiving reports that the Southern Transitional Council was planning to proclaim independence and join the Abraham Accords. And again, this is unlike Aden. Hadramaut and Mahra directly border Saudi Arabia. This was seen as a fundamental national security threat. And those of you familiar with Saudi foreign policy, I mean, Saudi Arabia is a country that likes to lead from behind. It likes to first forge a consensus and then see it implemented. This time they started bombing ships, delivering weapons to the STC in the port of Mukalla the next day, and got the Presidential Leadership Council, basically the organization they had set up that's known as the internationally recognized government, to demand the withdrawal of Emirati forces from Yemen, which they did. But more importantly, there weren't many Emirati troops in Yemen. Their main leverage in Yemen was the Southern Transitional Council. So they managed to disband it within the space of a week. And then they got Somalia to annul all existing agreements with the UAE. So the point I'm making is that we need to see the Saudi-Emirati rift within the broader context of Saudi opposition to the emergence of any new regional hegemon. So it's not so much specifically about Israel as Saudi Arabia seeking to retain its freedom of maneuver within the broader region.
Gaza was under
Correct.
how do you apportion responsibility between Egypt, Israel, and Palestinian leadership with chronic underdevelopment in that period?
How do I portion responsibility? Well, again, I think the first question that needs to be asked is, can the Gaza Strip be viable in and of itself, in isolation from the rest of Palestine, in isolation certainly from the West Bank? And I think the answer there is a clear no. So if you take a territory with a minuscule size of the Gaza Strip, no resources, you overnight increase the native population of 80,000 with 200,000 destitute refugees, and then you try to apportion blame for why it isn't Singapore. I mean, it was always going to be Soweto on the Mediterranean and not the Singapore of the Middle East, because it doesn't have the constitutive elements for successful development isolated from the region and certainly from the rest of Palestine. So sure, the Egyptians did not invest in the Gaza Strip between 48 and 67 because they saw it as an exposed buffer zone with Israel, and therefore didn't do so. The Palestinian leadership didn't really have a role in the Gaza. There really wasn't an independent Palestinian leadership prior to 1967. So they became much more of a factor after that period rather than before it. But I think the fundamental issue here is how the Gaza Strip came to exist, and how that existence, by definition, constrained any reasonable prospects for development.
I think you went too easy with the Arab regime and Muslim regime. They have been helping not only in the last 2.5 years of genocide, not only they were bystanders, they were helping Israel. The Israeli goods will go to United Arab Emirates with big trucks, go to Saudi Arabia and Jordan to Israel. Azerbaijan sending gold to Turkey and go to Israel from Turkey, and few the genocide. That's one thing. The second thing that I think is very important is that to see the issue of Palestinian as a Palestinian and Israeli issue. The much bigger issue is what the Zionists intend for the whole Middle East. The bigger Israel, which is from the Euphrates River to River Nile, they never deny that is their intention. They want to divide, according to Oded Plan, 1982, divide each country in the region to a smaller pieces based on their ethnicity, create problems for them, create animosity between different ethnic groups. For example, in Iran, we have 6, 7 ethnic groups. Divide and they
Fragment.
Start with Iraq. So they start with Iraq. The 7 countries that they said they are going to get rid of their government, and they are done with 6 of them almost. So if we don't look at the whole issue as a regional issue, that this is not going to stop. As soon as Assad gone, Israel went and captured Syrian territory. This is not about just Palestine. This is about what the Zionism is and what the Zionism want in the region. And as long as we have a Zionist state, there will be no peace in the Middle East.
Well, I didn't at all mean to suggest that this is not a regional issue, and I thought I spoke about its regional dimensions at length, so apologies if I was misunderstood. You referred to the Yinon proposal of 1982, and just for those of you unfamiliar with it, Oded Yinon was, I think, a former official or former journalist, who in 1982 published in Hebrew a proposal of I think it was called a strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And it was translated into English, and he basically um, uh, promotes the idea that Israel should seek the fragmentation of all the surrounding states on ethnic, sectarian, tribal lines. It was not an official policy, but and it was never adopted as such by the Israeli government. But many people have seen the reflection of its principles in Israeli regional policy regarding Azerbaijan. And its role in being a crucial supplier of oil, and particularly, I think, jet fuel to Israel. Not only supplying it, but supplying it through Turkey, which has been such a loudmouth for the past 2 years. I think you raise a very valid point. And for those who like to talk about that this is all about religious enmity and so on, well, Iran isn't the only Shia majority country in the Middle East. The other is, of course, Azerbaijan. And the love between Israel and Azerbaijan is, Romeo and Juliet for all intents and purposes. So, but I take your point. I do think you cannot understand the question of Palestine in isolation from all these regional dynamics.
So I just wondered, in your opinion, do you think the war with Iran is inevitable? I mean, either short-term, long-term? Because I've been sort of following it, and
Yes.
this whole business of it being an uprising, I mean, I've heard it called a coup, which is what I think what it was from what I've read. And
Well,
looking at other opinions, and it just seems the whole place is turning into a utter powder keg.
yes.
And it just seems to be at some stage inevitable.
Well, I am on record as saying that I believe another war with Iran to be not only inevitable but imminent, and I'm also on record, and even if I wasn't, it's just a fact. I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again, and I desperately hope that this is one of those times. I did purely by chance yesterday. I had a conversation with someone who was well plugged into government circles. And the analysis I received from this individual is that the Americans have accepted to conduct negotiations with the Iranians limited to the nuclear file, and that this American approach has produced a meltdown of nuclear proportions in Israel, because, of course, their agenda, for them, the nuclear issue is as much an objective as a pretext for a much larger agenda. And I was told the Israeli cabinet is apparently meeting today, and this individual that I spoke to expects that Israeli military operations against Iran will begin very soon in order to derail either the beginning or progress of such U.S.-Iranian negotiations. That sounds to me like an entirely plausible scenario, particularly because, as you will have seen, Trump appears to be someone with an increasingly tenuous hold on his own faculties, and where a different U.S. leader might be able to send a forceful message to the Israelis of, you're not going to do anything to undermine our negotiations with the Iranians. Under Trump, any scenario is as plausible as its opposite. So I still believe, that the direction of travel is very much towards war. And with this U.S. administration, I think, in fact, negotiations are probably an indication of the likelihood of war. But again, as I said, I've been wrong before, and I desperately hope that on this occasion I'm wrong again. Thank you. Could you speak up a little, please?
I just wanted to thank you for coming here, first of all.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to ask, I heard recent reports that Israel was dropping herbicide across Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
What could be the goal of Israeli planning? Do you have any idea?
I saw those reports, and I think, I don't think this is part of an agricultural development project, to put it mildly. And I think the objective here is to depopulate the border zone. And what you've seen Israel do, certainly in the Gaza Strip, now also in Syria and Lebanon, is to seek to create these depopulated buffer zones beyond its borders, under the pretext of security and self-defense. I mean, that seems to me the most logical explanation.
Well, what extent do you think other American wars in the Middle East, particularly
I don't. I do not think. I mean, in my experience, and as a dog owner myself, dogs wag tails. Tails don't wag dogs. And the U.S. is a dog, and Israel is a tail in this relationship. What you see repeatedly is when there is a fundamental U.S. national security interest at stake, as perceived by Washington, regardless of what you or I think about. The U.S. invariably wins. I mean, to give a recent example, Netanyahu even went and addressed a joint session of Congress to seek to prevent the U.S. from adopting the Iran nuclear agreement. He wasn't able to stop it. Of course, Trump renounced it, but that's a different story. And I could give you a whole set of examples where the U.S., when it believes a fundamental U.S. interest is at stake, is able to override any Israeli objections. Palestine is a different issue because Palestine is not a U.S. national security interest. And you can think of it as a relationship between two states where the U.S. is prepared to let Israel have its way on Palestine because that is very important to Israel, but of at best marginal importance to the United States. And in exchange, Israel is expected to toe the line on other issues. I mean, look at Syria. You had a new regime installed in Damascus. The Arab states began to actively lobby the Trump administration to lift the decades-long sanctions regime on Syria. Israel lobbied very hard to maintain those sanctions, at least until 2350. And it got nowhere. And they were lifted without so much as an apology to Israel, because the U.S., I believe, working closely with Turkey and the Gulf states, had a joint interest in a stable central government in Damascus. And Israel didn't stand a chance to undermine that agenda. Iraq, I think, is the same.
In terms of, let's say, a hard line, Palestinians themselves seem to have had a hard line in 47, have a hard line today, and in general, that practice leadership hard line.
What?
My family, they're from Northern Ireland, and I'll say that in terms of transcendence, it was in the 90s, there was a strategic move of what they would call the hard men on both sides, but especially on the rebel movement. Do you have any
By the rebel movement, you mean the IRA?
Yes. Now, do you have any personal experience, and obviously you're an Arabic scholar, do you have any sense of any possible movement of the hard men, Palestinian
Well, first of all, I don't think that you could describe the refusal of Palestinians in 1947 to forfeit more than half their country, sovereignty over half their country, to recent immigrants who didn't even comprise one third of the population as an extreme position. I can't imagine anyone else in their position having responded in any way differently. In terms of have they moved since then, well, in 1988, on the 15th of November to be precise, the Palestine Liberation Organization, recognized internationally as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, um, declared independence and declared independence by claiming sovereignty over the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And in doing so, as confirmed in the letters of recognition exchanged between PLO, chairman of the executive committee, Yasser Arafat, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, renounced Palestinian claims to not a third or a half or three quarters, but to 78% of the territory of mandatory Palestine, which Palestinians had traditionally claimed in full, and sought to exercise sovereignty over the remaining 22% of mandatory Palestine. Now, if that isn't a transition not from hard to soft, but from hard to limp, I don't know what is. I'm sorry, which 12 months? From the July? Yes. 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 I'm not sure. My understanding is that the court ruled that that the occupation must end as rapidly as possible. I don't recall them setting a specific time frame. Or am I mistaken? Hmm. My understanding was as rapidly as possible. But even let's assume for the sake of argument that it did set a timeline. I don't see that having an impact on the government's concern. No, unfortunately.
Wondering if any students had any questions.
Again, thank you very much, not only for being here, but for the amazing work that you've been doing from Jadaliyah.
Thank you.
It's really been remarkable.
Thank you. I appreciate
not
it.
only the persistence, but the quality of analysis.
Thank you.
I think Davina mentioned it's been a global audience. We all a great net to you. So in terms of this larger narrative, like let's say we're in a no-exit situation, and so this one narrative which compared to South Africa, which fueled the BDS movement, thinking that at a certain point there could be a tipping point in the same way that there was a tipping point in South Africa. On the other hand, there's this idea of what's happening inside Israel. When at the height of the Peace Now movement, how this shifted, and is there any hope there for internal change, public opinion inside Israel? And of course, the third probably exit point is China. In China, already, as you know, the last week,
Yes.
it's been wielding quite a lot of very impressive
Yes.
power. So I'm just thinking, is
Yeah.
there any
The first one was, the second one was Israeli domestic change. The third is China. BDS, yes. Yes. Well, just on the third, I do not see China becoming a particularly significant player on this issue, the question of Palestine. I have seen that in the past week, I think they took a decision to ban new investments in Israel yesterday. If that actually happens, China's primary interests are very much in the Persian Gulf region and the security of energy supplies. I think you can begin to see China play a more active role on Palestine as a consequence of a deteriorating relationship with Washington, but will it go beyond the rhetorical? Perhaps. Will it reach the level of having a significant impact? I very much doubt it. Just because, again, this is not at least so far as I can tell, does not have the prospect of becoming a fundamental Chinese policy concern or priority. Regarding domestic change within Israel, I think we're past that point. I think that is somewhere where we have reached a point of no return. It is a society that has become so consumed by radicalism, by fanaticism, by extremism, that I think rational voices are drowned out, chased out. I don't foresee circumstances in which they can have significant influence. I think they did 20 or 30 years ago. Certainly, for example, if you look at the period during the First Intifada, you had a very vibrant Israeli peace movement. I think the key question now within Israel is this new attempt to exclude Palestinian citizens of Israel from public life, with increasing levels of formality. And so I don't see the prospect of a vibrant Israeli peace movement emerging anytime soon. BDS, look, I think there has been a fundamental transformation of global and particularly Western public opinion as a result of the Gaza genocide. And I also think Israel has suffered irreversible losses, irretrievable losses. For these to be translated into different policies by governments towards Israel, I think is going to take a lot more work and is going to take significant time. I mean, we live in a world where the chasm between ruler and ruled, not only in authoritarian states, but also in democratic society, is increasingly large. And the impact of public opinion on leadership is increasingly difficult to enforce. And so I do think we will get there. I do think it will take a lot more work. Yes. Yeah.
Can you elaborate that a little bit, like how to get the violation of international law?
Yeah. Thank you. The point I was seeking to make is that the Russian war in Ukraine has not normalized the disintegration of international law because everyone recognized it for what it was. You didn't have, this, what's her name, that potted plant, the foreign minister of the EU, Kaya Kallas, or Ursula von der Leyen, or any of you. You didn't have these people come out and basically defend Russian conduct and say that it was consistent with international law and all the rest of it. So that's why I don't think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as illegal as it undoubtedly is, I don't think that in and of itself represents a threat to international law the way that the Gaza genocide has. Because there you have a lot of very influential statesmen and politicians basically saying not so much that this is in accordance with international law, but that international law needs to be dismantled if that is what is required to preserve Israeli impunity. I mean, look at the measures that have been taken against the International Criminal Court. It's not just Trump. I mean, we recently had confirmation that David Cameron, at the time the British Foreign Secretary, actually called the ICC prosecutor and warned him that if you issue arrest warrants against Israelis, we will withdraw from the Rome Statute and withdraw our funding of the ICC. Now, what do you think is going to happen if the ICJ rules against Israel in the genocide case? Or what if we are to find out that the ICJ judges in their majority did reach a conclusion Israel is guilty of violating the Genocide Convention, but give a different ruling because they don't want to be sanctioned, you know, as for example, UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese has, or as ICC judges have. So that didn't happen. None of that, you know, how many students were deported to Louisiana for writing an opinion piece in a school newspaper no one has ever heard of, criticizing the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That was the point I was seeking to make. Yes, yes, yes. Well, there hasn't been a campaign to prevent it from doing so. Of course, Russia has, you know, the power of veto in the Security Council, and I don't mean to minimize that. But has the ICC been in any way constrained in, you know, from acting? I'm sure the Russians would love to see the ICC go up in smoke this evening if they could, but who exactly has engaged in a systematic campaign of espionage against the ICC? Who has been trying to bribe the spouse of the former prosecutor? Who has been threatening people assisting the ICC and designating them as terrorists? You know, if it's Russia, I'm not aware of it. And the reason I'm not aware of it is because it has had 0.00 impact.
It's actually a Canadian judge who's held accounts process.
By the Russians?
No,
Oh.
by
By the US? Yeah, oh, yeah.
when you're talking about the judges.
Yes.
One was just saying one was actually a Canadian.
Ah, okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. Like Francesca.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they can still buy a BYD when they have to shop for their next car.
So one of the judges is actually a Canadian judge.
Ah, thanks for that.
I think we're nearing our time, but
I'm from Turkey, and then you described Erdogan. I agree with your sense. I feel like I sense it. Do you think the Turks or the Egyptians, I don't know the Egyptians, but my sense was the following: that Erdogan would be happy to have a deal with Trump for F-35, or maybe a more an acceptance of his presence in Syria. He would be more interested in what can I get out of this, and maybe I'll give some crumbs to the Palestinians. That's my sense.
Who, Trump or Erdogan?
Erdogan. So my sense was when the deal came out, when Erdogan went to Sharm el-Sheikh,
Yes.
I said the view is there to secure his own interests, to get F-35, to get normalize his presence in Syria, and clout his.
Yes.
So I don't think he is an honest friend of the Palestinians.
Well, no one is. I mean,
that's I know that.
I do think my reading. I'd be interested to hear if you agree. My reading of Turkish regional policy in 2026 is that the priority is very much Syria, and that if there is going to be an escalation between Israel and Turkey, it's going to be on account of Syria and not on account of Palestine, and that yeah, the F-35 program is obviously a big deal. And the other thing is, I think Turkey is trying very hard to have its forces injected into this international stabilization force that is supposed to be deployed in the Gaza Strip. But I don't think, my own view is that that's not going to happen. I mean, that the force isn't going to be established with or without Turkey.
With your permission, my reading is the following. I'm a Kurd, and of course Kurdistan was divided into 400 years ago as a colonial project because they refused to fight along with the British against the Turks. Today, as another colonial project, the Kurds are, like the gentleman said, 1988 or something, dividing the region into smaller countries. I think the Turkish government saw the developments of Kurdistan in northern Iraq, of Rojava, Turkey is next, and to create a Kurdistan that is landlocked, independent, dependent on Israel and the United States, jumping ground. So the Turks, in my opinion, see Rojava the next piece to the northern Iraq. So the Turkish fear is, next is ours. So
Interesting.
That is their soft spot.
Yeah. Interesting.
And then that's why they would persist on Syria and Rojava. That's why they pushed out the Kurds. Of course, that's my reading.
Interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you
for your stamina.
Thank you very much.
So we can all. I would like to just say another thank you to Mr. Rabbani for being here with us, Mouin for being here with us today, for your stamina, speaking for an hour off the cuff. Amazing. And for all of you for attending. And I did neglect to also thank the Center for Global Studies, who also helped to bring this.
Yes, I
event
neglected
together.
to thank them as well. So,
thank you very much for everyone here today.
thank you. Thank you very much.
You can take the mic off.
Sorry? Oh, no. There we go.